Good morning, and welcome to my AP Research presentation on political rhetoric and its impact on verbal discussions. In a country with increased polarization in our communities, especially with the most recent election, our country has become more and more divided. And so I wanted to explore the impact of psycholinguistics on individuals. Psycholinguistics is essentially the link between language and thought. And I wanted to explore the branch of psycholinguistics, and I did this through the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Sapir-Whorf in 1929 hypothesized that without language, we would have no thought. They said that language doesn't just shape communication, it also shapes someone's cognitive processes. While the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis focuses on thought, we can also look to bias and rhetoric to see how a news organization can utilize both of those to shape how we perceive an event. Coming to rhetoric and bias. Rhetoric is essentially persuasive language used by someone to influence beliefs or actions. Oftentimes, this is seen by political candidates in their speeches. Bias almost stems from rhetoric, and bias is essentially a preference that shapes how information is presented. Oftentimes, news organizations will utilize bias and rhetoric in subtle ways to influence the way someone thinks about an issue. Which leads me to my next point, that agenda setting theory is also significantly important when understanding an issue. Agenda setting theory by McCombs and Shaw in 1972 says that media can shape public opinion by determining what issues are most important. When looking at this diagram, we see that the agenda, there's the main issue, but you also have the agenda of the news organization. And it's up to them how they are going to interpret that information and pass it along to you. So depending on who you're listening to, you could have a completely different idea of what's going on in the world, just because the different agendas of different organizations. So next, I wanted to look at how media bias and perception influences speech patterns. Hemelinsky's study has been focusing on confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is essentially where people actively seek out information that aligns with their political beliefs. And so Hemelinsky's study found that oftentimes there is a linguistic divergence where people who have liberal beliefs will tend to use kinder language, whereas people with conservative beliefs tended to use more aggressive language. And he explained this because similar speech patterns associating with people who have similar ideologies creates an echo chamber, and also that influences the speech patterns someone uses. Also, when looking at bias acknowledgement, Matthews in his study found that people were generally pretty good at recognizing bias within news. However, when asked if they would change their consumption habits, participants did not want to change it and were okay with going along with accepting and consuming biased news, which was pretty interesting to me. So let's take a look at what we know on this topic. We know that news media can shape perception, especially as seen through that agenda setting theory. We also know that rhetoric and media bias can shape shape our political beliefs and how our actions and as well as our actions from what we listen to. Due to the rise of misinformation in recent years, it is important to investigate this issue, and because we're now more than ever more susceptible to rhetoric and bias. Coming off that, what we don't know is how language, especially written language, in a short amount of time, influences someone's speech patterns. And that is essentially what I will be investigating today. This leads me to my research question of how does short-term exposure to political rhetoric and written news media influences speech patterns and perceived bias recognition in young adults ages 15 to 21? So essentially, I'm seeing if political rhetoric influences the speech patterns of my participants and if they could recognize bias within that. For my method, I had utilized various sources as inspiration, such as Matthews and Neil Dixon, who both offered interesting perspectives to add to my method. For my method, I decided to use an experimental design, where I wanted to see how the type of article that a participant read had an influence on their speech patterns. I also decided to use a mixed method approach, with both qualitative and quantitative aspects. For qualitative, I had a guided interview, followed by a content analysis done by myself. And then for my quantitative section, I counted the frequency of bias used, and as well as a post survey, which recorded other things about such as demographics and bias recognition. Coming to my experimental design, I had 30 participants who were evenly split into Group A and Group B. Participants were ages 15 to 21, the average age being 17 years old. Once they did that, they came back to me for a semi-structured interview, where I asked them follow-up questions and to see what their discussion was on the topic. Once they did that, they completed a short post-survey. Let's look into really what my article really was about. So for my article, I decided to create it myself because I wanted to have control over the variables that I manipulated within it, which is why I chose the topic on the Tobin Law. The Tobin Law in France is essentially a law that requires language, the French language, to be used in government proceedings and written information, as well as in commercial use. And while this topic is true, it wasn't as controversial as I made it seem like. And so that's why I wanted to choose this topic, because participants didn't have any preconceived biases going into this. And that's why I chose the Tobin Law, because I didn't want to have any external influence in their speech patterns. So essentially, this is what the article looked like. This is the example from Group B. I made it look as real as possible. Both groups had the same exact title, picture, just different content. And this was especially important because I wanted the participant to feel that they were reading something real and authentic. And once the study was over, they were aware that the article wasn't true and not to make decisions off of that. So that establishes some ethical credibility with myself. They then did a semi-structured interview, as I mentioned earlier, and this was based off of Ruslin's study. I asked the following questions. The first one was, could you summarize the article and its main points in your own words? For this, I wanted to see how the information they read influenced their speech patterns. I also asked, what was the main issue the article highlights? I wanted to see if they could highlight the main issue and could discuss it either in a biased manner or that express both viewpoints. I also asked, did the article bring up any thoughts or emotions for you? So for this, I wanted to see if the article changed their thinking on the topic in any way. This semi-structured interview allowed me to ask some follow-up questions as well. For my post-survey, this was mainly about demographics. I wanted to see what the age, gender, as well as ideology of the participant was. This also asked about the article influence and the recognition of bias. I also asked about consumption habits, as Matthews did in his study, to see if his findings were applicable to this research. Now coming to my content analysis. I decided to utilize Dixon's research for this content analysis. So I used Dixon's research to create the Verbals Summary Rubric, the VSR. Now, Dixon's research was nowhere near what my topic was, but I had utilized her structure of the rubric in my research. The VSR had 6 categories, each category with a possible total points of 5, with the minimum being a 0, and then added up together to receive a final score of 30. I believe that this was the best way to actually quantify what people were saying. So here are the following categories. I looked at neutrality of the issue, as well as if they had a balanced discussion when discussing the topic. I wanted to see what the frequency of bias and partisan markers were in their response, and if the rhetorical intensity of their response. I had also looked at the clarity and coherence of their response, and if they utilized evidence throughout. Let's take a closer look at what this final rubric score told us. A score from 0 to 20 indicated that their response was generally pretty biased, with multiple rhetorical figures, and this really helped me solidify who was biased and who wasn't. So that leads me to a score from 21 to 30, indicates that their response was pretty objective and included a balanced discussion with minimal bias influence. Now let's take a look at my results. Oh, excuse me. My hypothesis comes first before my results. My first hypothesis is that participants in Group B who read the biased article will respond with more rhetorical characteristics than those in Group A. I further hypothesize that participants in Group A will receive higher scores on the VSR rubric than those in Group B. Now let's take a look at my results. 70% of participants in Group B use at least 3 to 5 biased terms within their response, which demonstrates that the article had a significant impact on the choice and language they use, especially when it comes to bias. Furthermore, 88% of Group A scored high on neutrality. This means that they scored at least a 4 or 5 in that rubric section of neutrality. Secondly, 100% of participants in Group B scored low on neutrality. So this is a score from 0 to about 2 or 3. And this really helped me solidify my results that the rhetoric used in the biased article had a pretty significant impact on the neutrality of their discussion as well as the biased terms that utilized throughout. Now, for my study, I decided to use a t-test, with my p-value being less than 0.0001, which makes the study statistically significant. Now, let's take a look at the average results for each Group A and Group B. For example, the average of VSR score was a 21.33, which is consistent with the final rubric category of being mostly neutral with minor rhetorical influences, but still well balanced. The final VSR score of Group B, on the other hand, was 11, which is almost a 10-point difference between each other. Group B's final rubric description was consistent with strongly influenced by rhetoric and clear partisan framing with multiple biased terms utilized throughout. Now, what does this actually tell us? Well, it tells us that short-term exposure to written political rhetoric has a significant impact on individual speech patterns, which demonstrates new findings and new findings to my field. Furthermore, I asked participants about bias recognition. I first asked how they felt in their ability to recognize biased language in writing. Most participants felt pretty confident, with about 12 participants saying rating themselves a 6 on a scale of 7. I decided to use the scale of 7 to produce ambiguity within responses because what differentiates 8 from a 9 on a 10-point scale. So using 7-point scale was pretty important in really solidifying my results. I further asked did they believe that the news they consumed was biased, and almost all participants said that at least somewhere they consumed biased news, with most participants saying that they certainly consumed biased news, which is pretty interesting to my study. Now, 93% of participants, when asked if they would change their consumption habits to include alternative perspectives, said yes, they would change their habits to include alternative perspectives or more unbiased news sources. This finding rejects Matthews' finding that young adults wouldn't want to change their habits, which also demonstrates a new understanding for the topic. So coming back to my hypotheses. My first hypothesis that Group B would have more rhetorical characteristics and biases than Group A turned out to be true. My second hypothesis that Group A would receive higher VSR scores compared to Group B also turned out to be true. Now, closing the gap, my research initially was exploring how rhetoric influenced speech patterns, because we didn't know how short-term exposure to political rhetoric, especially in a written sense, influences the patterns someone uses when they speak. My findings suggest that people who read biased and rhetorical news will often influences their speech patterns when they discuss that issue. Furthermore, when asked about bias recognition, most participants could identify bias and were certainly sure that bias exists within their news. However, when asked about bias recognition, when asked about changing consumption habits, participants did want to change their habit, which rejects Matthews' findings, as I had mentioned earlier, which demonstrates that participants in general wanted to incorporate alternative viewpoints and to have a more balanced discussion, which is pretty interesting, especially now that we live in a very polarized political field. Looking at my real-world implications, I found a couple things from my results. My results first indicated that, my results could have an influence on political communication, especially on how politicians and campaigns utilize rhetoric and bias. My results suggest that campaigns should use more bias and rhetorical terms in their campaigns to have more of a compelling and active campaign. However, this does have some downsides to it, as it could really result into more polarization, especially if the findings in my study are really put to the test where there's a lot of biased terms in the language. And on a topic that is unknown, this can have a significant impact on how people perceive and discuss the topic. Also, media literacy is very important, especially as to combat polarization. And there's a need globally for a more literate voter pool. And so my results would teach young voters how to critically analyze information, and it could also result in organizations being more aware of the biases they use in their language and should try to incorporate alternative viewpoints and perspectives within their writing. However, like any study, mine did have some limitations to it. The first one being, while I did try to stay neutral, the VSR analysis I conducted could have been subjective. There was unfortunately no way to combat this unless if I had included other researchers involved in the process, which could be done in the future. However, my artificial setting to my study is another limitation. Why the study I conducted was very controlled, and in the real world, that is not necessarily applicable. There's many other factors that could influence someone's speech patterns, such as demographics or age, gender, ideology, etc. We also don't know the lasting impact of my study. My study specifically focused on short-term exposure and language that focused right after they had been exposed to that. So we don't know if those characteristics are going to show up in the long run. And finally, my small sample size makes it difficult to universally apply these findings to globally. However, by increasing my sample size with a larger sample size, in the future, we could increase diversity with the study by increasing participants. For example, my study only had one conservative participant. So by increasing this diversity, we would have a larger variety of participants, and which would make my results more accurate. Furthermore, we would develop a deeper understanding of this topic and be able to apply it universally. From this deeper understanding, we could look at how long-term influence, how rhetoric in a long-term setting influences speech patterns, as well as the impact of demographics and how a certain ideology may discuss a topic compared to another. In a time of rising polarization, understanding how political rhetoric not just shapes what we believe, but how we speak is increasingly important. This study adds a new layer in understanding to the topic of psycholinguistics, and that language does influence the way we speak and the way we think. The study proves that our voices can literally be shaped by what we read. Thank you. And these are my references.
Okay, Trevor, how did you determine which results generated by your research method were most important in informing your new understanding?
Yeah. So when I originally conducted my research, especially within that post-survey section, I didn't necessarily want to include every single response that participants gave. Like, I had asked questions about if they discussed political content with their family members, or what specifically, where did they get their news, and I just felt that it wasn't important to add to this because I was specifically focusing on how rhetoric influences the way we speak, and those don't really have any relationship to how we recognize bias or how we discuss different news events. And so I just decided to exclude that because it was not beneficial to really make my line of reasoning clear. Also, within the VSR analysis, I decided not to include every specific detail of the response. It just was going to make my time longer, and this was not necessary to understand that my main findings showed that there is a significant influence of rhetoric in speech.
How did your new understanding address a gap in the scholarly conversation?
So initially, we did not know that, especially short-term exposure to written rhetoric, influence speech patterns. We talked about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis that that thought influences speech, and also the agenda-setting theory that certain news organizations have a specific agenda. But we didn't know how rhetoric shapes how someone speaks about an issue. And so my findings demonstrate that there is an influence within the rhetoric someone reads and how they speak about it, and that they incorporate that within their speech patterns, which is not known before my research. Thank you.
How did you handle the uncertainty of the research process?
Uncertainty was something that I came across a lot, especially with gathering my participants. It was challenging coming on to my participants, especially since I had a larger range of participants. So it was really important for me to try to include a larger variety of participants. And initially that was hard because I was really only exposed to a certain selective age group. But I had utilized my connections through work and through my mom, who's a college professor, to get that larger span of participants. And so that's actually how I overcame that challenge within my research.
Thank you.